Throughout history, there have been people who have committed some of the most heinous crimes fathomable. For those crimes, they have been convicted and sentenced to death. Welcome to Death Row Executions, where we take a look into the lives of society's worst offenders. And now, your host, Air.
William Edward Cook Jr., also dubbed Billy Boy and Cockeyed Cook, was born on December 23, 1928 in Joplin, which is in Jasper County, Missouri. Billy was one of 8 children. His father, William Cook Sr., was a drunk who worked as a miner. His mother, Laura, initially took care of her children and household, but she unexpectedly passed away. After that tragic event, William Sr. moved the whole family into an abandoned mine shaft. He went crazy. The whole family lived like animals, and they were sheltered from the world. William Sr. eventually abandoned his family in the mine shaft, leaving them to fend for themselves. Authorities ended up finding Billy and his siblings, but all of his 7 siblings were put into foster care, and Billy was the only one who became a ward of the state because of the way he looked. He had a deformed eye and a bad attitude, so no one was willing to have him in their home. Being secluded from the world with a crazy drunken father changed Billy for the worse. The only time someone agreed to be Billy's foster parent is when the court agreed to pay for his room and board. A foster mother took him in, but she was not interested in raising Billy. The money she received from the state was what she wanted. Because of this, Billy still did not receive any proper guidance and parenting. 2 Christmases in a row, Billy received brand new bicycles from his foster mother, but they were both repossessed for lack of payment. Not finding any solace at home, Billy started running the streets and stealing from people. When Billy was arrested for the first time for truancy at the age of 12, he told the judge that he would rather go to a reform school than back to his foster home, and the court allowed it. He spent a few months at the reform school, and when he was released, he quickly started dabbling into the same crimes he committed before the reform school. He ended up robbing a cab driver and made out with a whopping $11. He was caught, though, and he was sentenced to 5 years in a reformatory. In the reformatory, Billy was constantly getting into fights, and he would be the one to start them. His behavior was so bad that he was transferred to Missouri State Prison. The fights continued in prison, but he was around a tougher group of men who weren't necessarily threatened by Billy, even though he was a fighter. One inmate began to make fun of Billy's droopy eyelid, so once Billy got rec time and accessed a baseball bat, he started assaulting the inmate with it. The inmate was on the brink of death, but survived the ordeal. Billy wasn't given more prison time for that incident, and he was released in 1950. After being released, Billy made it back to his hometown in Joplin. He reunited with his father, who was still a drunk, and he told his father that he was going to live by the gun and roam. He traveled to Blythe, California, and worked as a dishwasher for a few months until December 1950, but honest work wasn't satisfying enough. He traveled to El Paso, Texas, acquired a .32 caliber pistol, and got the words "hard luck" tattooed on the back of 4 fingers on his left hand. On December 30th, 1950, a mechanic by the name of Lee Archer was driving his own vehicle in Lubbock, Texas. He saw Billy posing as a hitchhiker and picked him up. Billy robbed Lee at gunpoint. He was able to get $100 and then forced Lee into the trunk. Billy continued on with his drive, but he eventually ran out of gas when he was on Highway 66 between Tulsa, Oklahoma and Claremore. He ditched the car and pretended to be a hitchhiker again. It was New Year's Eve, and a man named Carl Mosser from Illinois, who was traveling with his wife and kids to New Mexico, decided to stop and help a poor motorist in trouble, or so they thought. Carl, his wife Thelma, Ronald Dean, Pamela Sue, Gary Carl, and the family dog were all happy with no fears until Billy pulled out his firearm and forced Carl to drive for a total of 72 hours, driving through states like New Mexico, Texas, and Arkansas. At one point, Carl stopped at a gas station in Wichita Falls, Texas, for food and gas. Carl mustered up enough courage to try and disarm Billy, but in the end, Billy was too strong for Carl. Carl had no choice but to listen to Billy's commands, but Billy would not let this moment go. He was so angry that he had his mind set on killing. Carl continued driving back to Joplin, where things were familiar to Billy. Once there, Billy killed the whole family, including the family dog. He then dumped their bodies down an abandoned mine shaft, just like the one he used to live in. The car was full of blood, but that did not stop Billy from continuing on with his drive. He drove around and eventually made his way to Oklahoma, but his car broke down. Billy made his way back to California, and while he was in California, the car he ditched in Oklahoma was found with blood and bullet holes in it. Also in the car was a receipt for Billy's gun. There was a manhunt to solve the murders and put the killer behind bars. Back in Blythe, California, Deputy Sheriff Homer Waldrip grew suspicious of Billy and wound up at a motel where he found out Billy was staying at with a friend. Deputy Waldrip wanted to question this friend, so he made his way to the motel room with the intentions of interviewing him, but to Deputy Waldrip's surprise, Billy was there, popped out from behind a door, attacked him, and stole his firearm. Deputy Waldrip was now Billy's hostage, and he forced him to drive around with no specific destination in mind. During the drive, Billy bragged about murdering a family with no care whatsoever. After less than 50 miles of driving, Billy ordered Deputy Waldrip to pull over and get out of the car. He then instructed him to lie face down in a ditch and told the deputy those would be his last moments on Earth. Scared for his life, Deputy Waldrip waited for his time to end, but Billy had a change of heart, got into the driver's side, and drove off, leaving Deputy Waldrip behind. After driving for some time, Billy got hold of another man by the name of Robert Dewey. Just like Carl Mosser, Robert tried to overpower Billy in an attempt to take his revolver from him, but he was wounded in the process. They also lost control of the car and it careened into the desert. Billy did not like anyone fighting back, and he again had his mind set on killing. He shot Robert in the head and then abandoned his car in Mexicali, Mexico. Authorities found Robert's body not too far from Mexicali, but in California. With a deputy alive to tell the tale of Billy and the trail of bodies he was leaving behind, authorities all over the U.S. were given the heads up about Billy. He was now back in Blythe, California, and he found 2 more men he did the same thing to when he initially met his previous victims. James Burke and Forrest Dameron were on a hunting trip together when Billy forced the men across the Mexican border into Santa Rosalia. Little did Billy know, authorities in Mexico knew about him as well, and he was spotted by Santa Rosalia Police Chief Luis Parra. Chief Parra walked right up behind Billy, snatched the .32 caliber revolver that was on Billy's waist belt, and arrested him. Back in the day, though, Mexico had no extradition policies in place with the United States, but Chief Parra was still willing to help the U.S. He, along with other Mexican officers, physically pushed Billy across the border so he could be arrested by U.S. officers. After being arrested, he was quoted saying, "I hate everybody's guts, and everybody hates mine." Billy was transported to Oklahoma City, Oklahoma to be tried for the murder of Carl Mosser and his family. Because Billy had taken the family across multiple state lines, his case became a federal case and eligible for the death sentence. Billy pled guilty. His mental health did come into question, but a psychiatrist said that even though he was a psychopath, he was a sane psychopath. Another psychiatrist believed he was insane, but the judge agreed that Billy was sane enough to stand trial. Billy was sentenced to 300 years in prison, 60 years for each family member he killed. He was to spend his sentence at Alcatraz. U.S. District Judge Stephen Chandler was quoted saying, "I do not think it can be justifiably said that the defendant had sufficient mental capacity to commit a crime warranting the death penalty by a jury or this court." The public was outraged, and many believed Billy should have been sentenced to death. U.S. Attorney Robert Shelton angrily shouted in court, "If there was ever a death penalty case in the history of the nation, this is a death penalty case. This boy's childhood is no justification for wiping out 6 people, an entire family in cold-blooded murder. I want the public and the court to know that I demand the death penalty in this case. If the court heard all of the facts in this case, I think the court might have reached a different opinion." Judge Chandler replied by saying he knew all of the facts of the case and he did not think Billy deserved to be executed. He went on to talk about Billy's upbringing and was quoted saying, "Society stands indicted for permitting this child to grow up among cruel and inhumane conditions and must accept part of the blame. This crime might never have been committed had this boy been given a civilized upbringing and education." Attorney Robert Shelton argued back with the judge, objected to those beliefs, and then began to talk about his own childhood. He then started to get emotional when he said, "My mother died when I was 5. I lived in a dugout, and I'm no criminal. I want the public to know I demand the death penalty. When the judge finished with the sentencing, he mentioned that despite the 300-year prison sentence, Billy would be eligible for parole after just serving 20 years. I would like to pause the video to ask you all if you agree with the judge or the attorney. Do you think Billy was screwed in the head because he grew up with a drunk in a cave and had no role models? Do you think people like Billy who are saved from those harsh conditions should have mandatory therapy or a school to help them integrate into society? Should there be mandatory evaluations? Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. The public was outraged and demanded that Billy be put on trial for the murder he committed in California. The courts acted quick, and just hours after his verdict in Oklahoma in 1951, California charged Billy with first-degree murder for killing Robert Dewey. There was no recommendation for life in prison, and the death sentence was on the table. Billy was found guilty in November of 1951 after less than an hour of deliberations. He was sentenced to death, trumping his previous 300-year sentence in Oklahoma. Onlookers said that when he received his death sentence, he was smirking and had a big grin on his face. Billy was transferred to San Quentin Prison in California. Billy's execution date was set for December 12, 1952, after all of his appeals were exhausted. Before his execution, Billy had a final meal of fried chicken, French fried potatoes, peas, pumpkin pie, coffee, and milk. Back then, California was executing its inmates with the gas chamber. The public felt that Billy was paying the price for killing 6 people within a 22-day period. He was executed at the age of 23, and 3 days after being executed, his body was put on display for the public to see at the Comanche, Oklahoma funeral home. 15,000 people were able to view his body before relatives of his finally stood up for him and stopped the showing. 3 days after the viewing, William Edward Billy Cook was buried at the Peace Cemetery in Joplin. Thank you all for watching another episode of Death Row Executions. Let me know what you guys think of this story in the comments below.